Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 4. A Long Drive. David walked inside the old stable positioned near the southeastern border of Aram, carrying a plain brown rucksack on his back. Like much of Aram, the stable was once a busy place where the human populace tended their horses and repaired their horse-drawn carts. But since the Tepish takeover, its owners had abandoned the structure, which served David's purpose perfectly. Instead of his Rostem gear, David was dressed in the plain style he had grown up wearing: white shirt and stockings, brown breeches and waistcoat, and leather shoes. Simple elegance, his father had always called it. His rucksack contained his Rostem clothing as well as his gauntlets and sword. Though the sack did not appear large enough to accommodate his sword, David had altered the design of the sack to accommodate the sword at an angle. He knew if someone peered too closely at it, they might question what it contained, but at a distance, no one would notice it. He crossed to the back of the stable where the loft had caved in a couple of years ago. Resting quietly under the mayhem in a carefully cleared-out area was a levicart that David held just as sacred as his beloved sword, because just like his sword, the cart belonged to Zechariah. He pulled the cover from the cart and shook the hay from it before placing it in the rear seat. The outside of the levicart looked like the typical box design that permeated the simple horse-drawn carts of the day, but the seats for the driver and passenger were set down into the body of the cart a couple feet from the front behind a glass window. The inside of the front and rear contained the levicoils and inner workings of the cart, which were accessible through hinged lids at both ends. The rear had leather straps on top, which David had used to tie various large items down so they would remain stable on the cart while it was moving, as well as other hinged storage compartments used for miscellaneous cargo, including the cover David had just removed to disguise the cart during the day and hide it when necessary. When not in use, the cart sat directly on the ground on 4 6-inch legs. Over the years, David had learned much about the care of levicarts, and he had kept Zechariah's in top condition, replacing parts as needed. The exterior was not what it was since he was unable to store it as well as Zechariah had done all the years before, but it was one of few levicarts outside of the Tepish supply that was still operational. The Rostem had used it on a few occasions when needed, but in order to preserve secrecy, they preferred to travel by horseback or on foot. Tonight they had to reach Kaliram, which was far enough away that while it was possible to reach it on horseback, they needed to give the appearance of approaching the town on foot. Only the levicart could be hidden somewhere for several days to provide a return avenue for them when they completed their mission. David opened one of the rear compartments and placed his rucksack within it, and then he walked to the driver's seat and flipped the switch that powered on the levicoils. They sparked to life and began turning. David marveled at the construction of the levicart every time he saw it. When he met Zechariah, it was a magical device, and now, understanding its construction and purpose, it lost none of its mystique. He stepped back as it lifted about 6 inches off its short legs. David retracted the legs and pulled the cart slowly out of its tomb across the floor of the ruined stable. He reached the door and looked out slowly to ensure that there were no Tepish watching. He figured that if any had seen him enter the stable, they would have already cornered him. The night was dark and quiet. He felt that his hiding place remained undiscovered. He opened the door to the stable fully and climbed into the levicart. It had been a few months since he needed to drive the cart, so he knew he would enjoy the ride immensely. He grasped the 2 levers on either side of the driver's seat and pushed them forward together. The levicart moved forward. David smiled. He pulled back on the right lever and the cart turned to the right to point out of town. He moved the right lever back forward again and took a breath, preparing for the rush. He pushed both levers forward as far as they would go, and the rear of the levicart hummed loudly before it shot off into the night. David smiled widely as he felt the wind blast through his hair. If there was anything about being a Fempiror that he loved, it was this machine. While David had originally suggested meeting at the stable, he had forgotten in the moment the foolishness of the suggestion. Tiberius had told him before that taking more than one person to that place would risk drawing attention to where he kept his cart, and the cart was too important to take that risk. Besides, the stable was deliberately out of the way for everyone, while the shack was remarkably close to where they had met. He flew around the outer edge of town until he spotted the small shack where they were meeting to leave for Calirum. No one was visible at this time, but he expected that. They would be watching for him. He steered toward the shack and slowed the levicart to a crawl again. Slowly he flew the cart into the shadow of the shack, lowered its legs, and turned off the power. The levicart's hum slowly diminished into silence as it lowered to the ground. He removed the cover from the rear seat and covered the cart again. Although it would be difficult to see the cart in the shadows, it might be visible if someone came too close. As he walked around the shack, he considered what he might say to Beth. They had a long ride ahead of them, and it would be very awkward to spend it in silence. Tiberius, Ulrich, and Beth emerged from the door of the shack. David stopped, surprised to see them come out. His gaze, however, was drawn to Beth and her choice of clothing. It occurred to him that he was staring, but he could not help it. She wore the blue and white dress that she had made under the tutelage of David's mother, the mantua maker of Hoggenstown. Beth had worn this dress on the night of David's transmutation, and again on the night that he had changed her. She had also taken her hair down, showing that it remained as long as it ever had been, so that she looked almost exactly as she did then. It took him a moment to recover from the jolt of the past. She held a small leather bag, in which he presumed she carried what little she needed. "I thought we were meeting inside," David said. "Calirum is far enough that you'll need to get moving as soon as possible," Tiberius said. "There is nothing more to discuss that you both don't already know." "Nothing?" David asked as he shot his eyes to Beth and back to Tiberius. Tiberius shook his head. "David, you have all the details we can give you," he replied. "Whatever additional information you need, you will need to work out for yourself. I can't have all the answers." David nodded. He had hoped Tiberius or Ulrich might give him some idea as to any underlying intent to pairing him with Beth, but Tiberius gave up nothing. He walked to the levicart and removed the cover. This time he stowed it in the compartment at the rear of the cart. Beth silently walked to the passenger side and climbed in. David watched her for a moment. She did not even glance at him. David switched on the cart, and it hovered off the ground. "There is a cave due southeast of the town," Tiberius said. "It's about an hour's walk from there, so you should have time to get settled before sunrise. It is imperative that you walk into town and not take the cart. That's another reason you need to go quickly. You need time to get to town at a walking pace. Today is the 12th. We will meet you at that cave at midnight on the 14th. "Will it be you?" David asked. "Unless we run into trouble, and then it may be no one," Tiberius replied. "Gus klug den Jehovah batosu fumor," Ulrich said in Philetarusk. David knew what it meant this time. "Good luck, and God be with you." "We will see you in 2 days," David said. He jumped into the cart and retracted the short legs. He slowly moved the control levers forward and steered the cart around the 2 leaders. Once he was clear of them, he pushed the levers all the way forward again and shot off into the night away from Aram. Now, flying at top speed across the open fields, he could really enjoy the speed of the cart. He relished the wind whipping through his hair, and part of him remembered almost losing his hat the first time he felt this rush. He had not worn a hat in years, however, since it was not part of the Rostem dress. He knew that the newer carts went quite a bit faster than Zechariah's older model, but growing up in a world that primarily walks, this was enough for him. He glanced sideways to Beth. She sat silently next to him, looking out across the fields on her side of the cart. The wind had picked up her hair and carried it as they flew. He wondered what she thought about being thrust next to him after all these years. Remembering how they had parted, he could not imagine she was altogether happy about this. He looked forward again as the landscape rushed by. Should he try to talk to her? Would she respond? What should he say? What would she say? He looked at her again, but she continued to stare away from him. He opened his mouth several times to say something, even just to greet her, but his words failed him each time, and he remained silent. He looked forward again and resolved to try to talk to her if she would just look at him. Or perhaps he would say something even if she made a sound. Unfortunately, she remained completely quiet. She never uttered a word or sound, nor did she turn from her view of the passing fields as the wind trailed her hair out behind her. The minutes at the beginning of the flight stretched into hours, and still neither one of them spoke. David continued to wait for Beth, but Beth never moved. Before he knew it, he saw a little town to the north a short distance that was uncommonly bright for the middle of the night. David searched the hilly terrain for the cave Tiberius had described, and quickly found the black hole in the landscape. He flew the levicart into the cave, lowered its legs, and shut it down. Without a word, Beth leapt out of the cart, retrieved her small bag, and walked out of the cave. David wondered if she would just walk to Calirum without him, but she stopped just outside the cave entrance and waited for him. Just out of talking distance, David mentally noted. David retrieved his rucksack from the storage compartment of the cart, placed it on the ground, and then quickly covered the levicart. He slung the sack onto his back and walked out to meet Beth. She started walking toward the town as soon as he passed out of the cave, and he had to jog a little to catch up with her at the pace she was setting. She glanced at his pack as he approached, and from her expression she must have noticed the bulge of the sword. "Are you supposed to have that?" Beth scoffed. "I stole it from a dead vampire," David told her. "What?" Beth said, disbelieving. "Tiberius said not to go unarmed, so we worked out a cover story as to why I have it with me." Beth said, unimpressed. "I don't require any such extensions, but that always has been the difference between the Rostem and the Alewo." David glanced at her, surprised. She had really embraced the Alewo philosophies. She turned from him with a smirk. He was grateful they were at least talking about something. The silence was killing him. "I can hold my own in hand-to-hand combat," David said with a shrug. He was unsure how he would hold up against an Alewo, but he had dealt with unarmed combat on a few occasions. "Really?" Beth asked. "Really," David confirmed. "You want to test that?" she asked him. David looked at her, surprised. Alewo only practiced their hand-to-hand combat with each other, and they never openly challenged anyone. "All right," David replied. He knew Beth had her reasons for wanting to have it out with him, and perhaps she wanted to get this out of the way before they got too far into the mission. If she had learned the Alewo combat style as well as she learned everything else before her transmutation, he would not stand a chance. He placed his sack on the ground and stood at an arm's length from her. Her face showed boredom, of all things. She had embraced the Alewo stoicism as well as their discipline. He also saw that she was completely serious, and as such he could not fake his way through this. To feign an attack would insult her discipline, and possibly make this even worse for him. He studied her closely, hoping to catch some sign that she was not serious about this, but she maintained her defensive stance. This was no longer a man and woman. This was two fighters facing off against each other, so he needed to strike all thoughts of chivalry and love from his mind. He had to think of her as a rival, and not as the love he lost once. With a deep breath, he delivered a lightning-fast punch toward her face. It never found its mark. She stopped his hand and swept his feet out from under him before he had a moment to recover. She stood back up, and he attempted to leap to his feet. Before he could find his footing, she upset his balance and threw a punch at his face. The blow stopped less than an inch from finding its mark. The wind from the speed of her thrust hit him in the face seconds after she had stopped. He watched her staring into his eyes. In that dress, she still looked like the girl he wanted to marry back in Hogginstown, but the face had changed. Now she was a seasoned combatant. Lethal. Why had she stopped? If she wanted to hit him, now was her chance. She held the death blow position for a long time. Perhaps she was considering following through. Perhaps she was wondering why she had not. Whatever she was thinking, she finally released him. He climbed to his feet and brushed the grass off his clothes. "He who makes the first blow places himself at an immediate disadvantage," she said simply. "I think I've heard that one before," he said with a smile. "And yet you didn't listen," she said. "Typical. You really do belong with the Rostem, don't you?" She turned and walked toward the town, not waiting for him again. Of course, he knew what she was talking about. If he had listened to Zechariah 10 years ago, she would not be here today. His failure to listen had led him to see her one last time and changed her into a Fempiror. He put his sack on and adjusted the sword to where it was the most inconspicuous. He jogged the short distance to catch up to her again. He glanced at her, and she continued staring forward, not acknowledging him. The town was still some distance off, and he had had enough of the silence. He had no doubt that their leaders had sent them together to talk this out, and he felt the need to start it. He took a deep breath and just said it. "I didn't mean to, you know," he told her a little more sheepishly than he planned. "I know," she said, her expression never changing. "I never would have," he began. "I know," she interrupted him. They continued their walk toward the town in silence again. This was not going to work if she was going to talk over him. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and noticed that some emotion was coming through. Her eyes were filling with tears. "I wish I could change what," he began again. "No, it's not that," Beth said, interrupting him again. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't hate you," she said. He breathed a sigh of relief. "I thought I would," she continued, "but I really don't. When I saw you the other night, I was just so surprised She broke off and turned her head away from him. "You didn't know what to say?" he finished for her. She nodded in response, not turning to him. "I was rather taken aback too," he said. "In that moment, I was flooded with the memories of a life I thought I'd forgotten all about. Everything I had to leave behind, hopes and regrets alike." "What do you regret?" he asked. She scoffed. "What do you think, David? What did we discuss back then? What was my one desire in the whole world?" He sighed and nodded. "Children." "Children," she confirmed. "We were supposed to have children by now. I was supposed to have been a mother to however many children a woman can bear in 10 years. Where are my children? Where is my family? Where is the life I promised myself? Nowhere. I didn't even get to say goodbye to my family. They won't ever know what happened to me." "Abraham will say I kidnapped you," he suggested. "Probably," she agreed. "I heard about that." "You did?" he asked in surprise. She nodded and smiled. "Ulrich and Tiberius keep well in touch," she said. "I wonder how he's doing sometimes." "He probably married Mary Dillinger, like he said." She laughed and shook her head. "Poor Abraham. He loved me, you know." David nodded. "I know." Abraham was one of the other great regrets of that night. Through his persistence, Abraham forced David to toss him from the back of a moving levee cart in order to keep him safe and away from this world. David wished he could have at least taken Abraham home and left him with some kind words, but Abraham was upset over Beth's transmutation. David definitely understood this. David looked ahead to find the town growing closer with every step, walking side by side with the love he had grown up with. They had made a start on this journey of reconciliation, but soon it would be time to put their past aside and work. Ironically, their job was to pretend to be the one thing they had desired more than anything else before any of this new life ever happened.